Hey everyone, this is Dustin with Timber Ridge Table Company, and this week we're showing you the process we take to build this massive 9-foot dining room table with 2 matching benches made from locally sourced elm. Our customers decided to go with this massive elm slab. It started out 14 foot long and ranged from 38 inches wide all the way up to 55 inches wide. Our first step to this project was cutting the slab down a couple inches more than 9 foot. After cutting it down, it was time to start flattening it. We are only doing a couple of passes on our jointed wood flattening machine since we need to fill the voids with epoxy. We want to keep it as thick as possible for as long as possible. After the slab is flattened, we need to clean out the voids. We are using a 4-inch wire wheel and a chisel to remove the bark and dirt. Now that the voids are clean, we need to flip the slab over to the bottom and start making the mold. When dealing with slabs like these that don't need a ton of epoxy, we like to use a sheet of plywood with tuck tape. Tuck tape prevents the epoxy from sticking to the plywood. Now we applied a bead of silicone around the entire void. Then we placed the plywood on top. The crotch of the slab wasn't completely flat, so we screwed the piece of plywood down to help the slab flatten out once the epoxy cures. After we screwed down the plywood, we then run another bead of silicone around the edge of it. This helps prevent the epoxy from leaking. The epoxy ended up getting past the first layer of silicone from this section, but could not make it past the second layer. While doing this section, we ran out of silicone and decided to use caulk instead. We should have opted to going to the store and buying more, since caulk doesn't hold up as well as silicone. This ended up causing us to have a couple of leaks in this section. Now that the bottom was done, we need to flip the slab back over. You can watch me struggle as I put another piece of plywood down to give the slab a third point of contact and help level it out. End up having to give up on that piece and decide to go with a smaller one. The final step of making this mold is by attaching the walls. This is just a small piece of wood with tuck tape and caulk around the voids. I don't put any supports on these end pieces as I've seen just putting silicone is enough to hold in the epoxy. While we let the silicone dry for the next 24 hours, we began to work on the benches. We were using the leftover pieces from the elm slab to create these 2 benches. This part of the slab was cupped a good amount, so we decided to cut them in half before flattening to save more material. While turning the slabs, I decided it would make great content to drop them and almost crush my feet. Luckily, I just missed and I was able to go on with the day. Now I need to shim and screw down the pieces so when I start to flatten they won't wobble. The jointed wood flattening machine makes quick work since it's a 12-inch planer and sander head. Once I flatten both pieces, I then take them to our 25-inch planer. The reason I do this instead of just flattening both sides on this machine is because both pieces are less than 25 inches wide and the planer will be faster since I won't have to screw the pieces down. After running through the planer, we then cut them down to size using our track saw. We like to take 2 passes on our saw since it doesn't have high power and struggles to cut 2-inch materials. Since these 2 pieces are benches, we cut one straight edge so it's more comfortable sitting down. Then we cut 90 degrees on both ends to give it a finished look. Now it's time to start final sanding and rounding over the edges. We first start off by sanding 120 grit on the face and sides of the benches. Then we take our Milwaukee router out and do a slight round over on the sides. The customer opted for a polyurethane finish, so after we did the roundovers, we like to sand the entire piece with 220 grit. After you round over the edges, you have to be very careful when sanding because if you sand off too much of the roundover, it will not look uniform anymore. This is why we only sand the roundover with 220 grit since it's less aggressive sandpaper. After waiting 24 hours, the silicone is dried and the epoxy is ready to be poured. The customer opted for a clear epoxy since they wanted to see the natural void. After mixing the epoxy, it will have a decent amount of bubbles, so we then use a torch to pop all the bubbles. Normally the epoxy takes about a week to cure, but our AC unit decided to stop working in the middle of this pour, so it cured in about 3 days. We did have a couple leaks, so we needed to do a second pour. Since the epoxy had hardened pretty fast, we weren't able to do a second pour while the epoxy was still soft, so we had to wait for it to get completely hard and sand it with 220 grit. This makes a mechanical bond between each layer of the epoxy versus a chemical bond if we would have poured the second layer while it was still soft. After all the epoxy is sanded, we then take alcohol and clean all the dust, and this will also help the bond between each layer. After the second pour of epoxy was cured, we needed to demold the slab. So we took out all of the screws and then used a shim to separate the pieces and pulled off the epoxy. Tuck tape does a really good job not sticking to the epoxy, so it's fairly easy to take apart. After the slab is demolded, it was time to do the final flattening. We start by flattening the top side. The reason we do the top side first is in case we need to take off a lot of materials and the slab starts looking thin. We want to make sure this side is completely flat so you won't feel any imperfections. If the slab starts getting too thin and the bottom of the slab isn't completely flat, it won't be noticeable. We don't normally have to deal with this problem since we got our slabs cut at 3 inches thick. After the slab is flattened, we need to start filling the smaller voids. We recently started using this UV resin by Total Boat, and so far we absolutely love it. It cures very fast and clear with our UV light. Before using the UV light, you can take a heat gun to pop all the bubbles just like an epoxy. The resin comes with a small light, but we like to use our vesting light since it cures the resin much faster. We like to use this project for spots that are a little larger and easy for the light to access. Another product we use is FastCap 2P10 CA glue. We use this product for very small voids that are hard to get to. This product cures very quickly with an activator, which is good because a lot of times after sanding the voids it will need to be filled again. Filling these small voids are very time consuming since there is always a lot of them throughout the entire slab. Once we have all the voids filled, we then start working on the live edges. We first sand with 120 grit to round over the corners so they're not sharp. Then we take our restorer and go over the sides, removing the membrane and keeping the natural look of the tree. The restorer does a great job with giving the side of the slab a natural texture while also making sure it's smooth enough that nothing would get caught to it. Now it's time to start doing the final sanding. On large tables like this, we like to take a lumber crayon and draw over the entire slab so we can see where we have sanded it and where we have not. Right after beginning to do the final sanding, you can see I needed to refill a void, which happened multiple times. We started with 120 grit on the entire top, then rounded over the edges. After rounding over the edges, we then switched to 220 grit, then from 220 to 400. The sanding process took around 8 hours and is definitely the longest part of the process. Since our customer opted for a 2K polyurethane finish, it was time to take the top to our friends at Carroll Creek Refinishing. We couldn't get a video of finishing this table, so this is them finishing a previous table for us. This is our most durable finish we offer as it protects really well against stains and scratches. Once they finish the table, we take it back to our shop to attach the table base and do final touches. As you can see, Ali had to supervise the step to make sure I was doing it correct. We like to polish the finish to give the epoxy some extra clarity and give the top a silky smooth finish. We had a lot of fun building this table and we're very excited that our clients were able to provide the sewing machine bases that were passed down from their parents. We want to thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. We would also love to hear your comments on what you thought about the table and the video as we are always looking to improve. Thank you guys again and see you next time.